was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of childbirth. It was the epoch of breastfeeding. It was the season of a mummy tummy. And it was the spring of trying to fit into historical clothing, but not having any appropriate foundation garments. Yes, here I am, everybody. I've spent the past year traveling with you guys through a pregnancy of making historically inspired clothing. And now here I am, a postpartum mama with a changing figure, breastfeeding to accommodate. And what can I say? I need some new foundation garments. So having spent the 9 months of my pregnancy craving to make all the corsets and not being able to, I have resolved that now I will simply make every style and every era of corset possibly available. I will make all the corsets. This video will be focused on the creation of two very, very different corset mock-ups. In fact, I would consider these two eras of corsets to be on opposite ends of the corsetry spectrum in terms of their shape and silhouette and goals. We're going to be making a late Victorian spoon busk corset mock-up with a very curved front, which actually accentuates a round tummy shape, and a very curved and accentuated bust area. And secondly, we'll be making a pair of 18th century stays, which have a very flat front, flattened bust, and conical shape. We're going to analyze how they accommodate my slight mummy tummy, my need to breastfeed 1,000 times within a 24-hour period, and overall how they fit and make me feel. My main concerns are the ability of the corset to shape my figure, reduce my waist a tad bit, and also feel comfortable and not compress my body very much at all. So let's just jump into it. So let's start with the patterns. Both of the patterns for these corset mock-ups were drafted according to my own measurements from the book Stays and Corsets by Mandy Barrington. This book is super helpful because not only does it give you instructions on how to take your own measurements and how to draft your own bodice block, but it walks you through drafting many different styles of corsets and stays according to your own measurements. So when I was drafting these patterns, for the Victorian corset, I completely just followed the directions because I wanted that exact style and look. However, when I was drafting my 18th century stays, I wanted stays that were much longer than the ones in the book, and so I followed the instructions for the top half, which I liked, but the bottom half I kind of just eyeballed and referenced other patterns and did my best that way because I wanted them to be longer. The drafting is really a subject for another video. I will leave some extra details in the blog post linked below. Okay, so let's start out with the Victorian corset. The first decision after drafting my pattern that I needed to make was how I wanted the grain lines to be. Now, the book that I was following the directions on seemed to have all the pieces placed on grain, as most modern corsets are, but I am really interested in how many Victorian corsets had their panels drafted slightly off grain, and I think that really helps them sit beautifully on the body without wrinkling. And so I looked at similar corset patterns from other corset drafting books that I have, and I decided to go with basically the most creative option for grain lines, and that included having basically all the panels slightly off grain. So I traced off my pattern pieces, I added my 1 centimeter seam allowance and cut them out, and now it was time to start sewing them together. So I just went ahead and I sewed them together straight on the machine without basting because this was just a mock-up. And after sewing, I pressed them at the ironing board over a tailor's ham. A tailor's ham basically holds the curved shape in place on the corset panels. So now it was time to add the spoon busk. I was a little nervous about this because I haven't done a spoon busk in like years and I've only done it once. So anyways, I began with adding a center front facing because this was a single layer corset for the mock-up, and so you need an extra layer just to hold that busk in place. So I added my center front facing. Now on the side of the busk with the knobs, I could just sew it on normally, but on the side of the busk that has the loop sticking out, I had to carefully mark the placement of each loop and then make sure not to sew in between those spaces so that after the seam was pressed open, I could just stick the loops of the busk through those openings. I should get to the knob side of the busk. So for that side, I marked each knob one at a time. So I would mark one knob, poke a hole through with my awl, get that knob through the hole, and then go on to the next one. You could theoretically just mark them all at once, but there's a high chance of them not lining up in the end. So I recommend doing it one at a time. And finally, it was time for top stitching around the very edge of that spoon busk. And this was very, very tricky, and it really made me reconsider if I want to do this step by machine on my final corset, because it's just so hard to get the stitching close enough to the busk to hold the busk in place without moving around, while also not like hitting your needle on the busk and having a broken needle fly into your eyeball. So it's kind of a balancing act. So for the lacing for my corset mock-ups, I opted to use this awesome lacing tape with pre-installed eyelets, which I got from Farthingale's corset making supply. So all you do is you first have to subtract the amount of width from the center back panel that the lacing tape has, and then you just stitch it in place, and it already has the boning channels ready to go. So you just add your boning channels and you add your boning, into the channels, and then you're ready to go. For my boning channels, for the quickest possible option, I decided to just use this 1-inch wide woven cotton tape from Burnley and Trowbridge, but you could use anything. You could use twill tape, you could probably even use ribbon if this is just a mock-up. And I just sewed that in the middle of each panel. Now, normally you would want to do this over the seams as well as in the middle if this was a final corset, but I didn't want to have anything interfering with the seams because this was a mock-up and I might need to make some changes to those seams later. And then I went ahead and I cut my strips of synthetic boning, synthetic whalebone, with my kitchen scissors, they really seem like the best scissors for this purpose, and I don't have to worry about ruining them the same way with my fabric scissors. And I inserted a strip of boning into each boning channel. And then finally, I laced it up. And tried on the corset. So honestly, my initial reaction with this mock-up was that it fit amazingly. It was probably the best fitting mock-up of a corset that I've ever made, because as a longer waisted person, usually I have to deal with the issue of the waistline or the bust line not sitting in the right place vertical wise on my body. But since this was a self-drafted pattern, that was ready to go. It was perfectly fine. The only issue that I noticed right away was that at the lower center front, there was definitely some awkward protrusion, just too much fabric there. And it also could have used a little more width at the back hip area. So that's an easy fix. You can just transfer some of that extra width to the back. I did actually wear this corset mock-up for a couple days. I've actually been wearing it since I made it. And that was really a good idea because it gave me an idea of how it fits throughout the day for a long period of time. I did notice that it was feeling a bit loose, and that was a criticism I've heard about this book, is that since it creates corset patterns for a modern body, they do fit more loosely. All you have to do is just take that into account when you're entering your measurements and deciding what measurements you're going to use to draft the pattern. You could just be a little conservative and use slightly smaller measurements and end up with a corset that's a little more tighter fitting. And for me, that's what I want. I want a corset that, it's not too tight, but it's definitely tight, like a corset's supposed to be tight. So I did, of course, decide to reduce the waist area, and I also decided to take some out of the back area at the bust line, but at the back. The front bust area fit me fine, but I do have a smaller back, so I decided to just take some out at that area as well. If you're interested in the exact details of how I alter this pattern to fit me better, then check out the blog post, which will be linked below. Okay, so let's get into the construction of the stays mock-up now. So for the stays, this had to be a double layer construction because there's so many boning channels that are crisscrossing and everything that it didn't make sense to use an external tape boning channel. You really just want to sandwich those boning channels between 2 layers of fabric. So I went ahead, traced off my pieces around the sewing line, and then added my 1 centimeter seam allowance manually and cut out all my pieces, this time with 4 of every pattern piece because you need 1 for each side, and then I was using 2 layers on each side. So I'm still not quite familiar, even though I want to be, with quicker, more modern construction methods for stays. So I went ahead and I just started constructing them in the traditional way, which is how I learned to make stays. So you essentially just work on 1 panel at a time. You add your boning channels in. So that's what I did. I just eyeballed the boning channels, looking at the pattern and drawing them on with my ruler as a guide, and also a strip of the boning I was planning on using, just to make sure that I got the width correct. So when stitching crisscrossing boning channels, the solution I found is you don't want to sew through those intersections because then the bones wouldn't be able to go through. So what I do is I just sew down all the way to the point of that intersection, and then I stop my needle in the fabric and I pivot the fabric, and then I just keep on sewing in another direction. And I just keep doing that until I've covered all the lines with stitching. And of course, for the lacing of these stays, I used the same eyelet tape that I used for my Victorian corset. So again, I just subtracted the width of the eyelet tape from the center back panel, cut that off, and then stitched on the lacing tape, added my boning, and it was ready to go. And then of course, I added the boning for the rest of the panels. Again, the panels were not attached to this time, so I just did 1 at a time. And it's a lot easier to add the boning into stays when the panels are separate like this, because there's so many different channels going in all different directions that it's easier to access them this way. So I just cut my boning to length and inserted it in, and it was ready to go. Now, the traditional way that I've learned to construct stays is by pressing the seam allowances under and then whip stitching them together. Now, when I attempted to do that on this mock-up, it was strangely very difficult, more difficult than it has been on actual finished stays. And so I opted to simply sew a basting stitch, a hand basting stitch, connecting them right along the sewing lines. And then I went to my machine and machine stitched it just for extra stability using a zipper foot so it wouldn't interfere with the boning that was already inserted. So after that was done, it was time to lace up these stays. This was a huge dilemma for me because if you watched my latest stay making video about the 1790s stays, I'm very apprehensive about closed front stays because they're so much more difficult to get on and off than something with a busk. And I really had been considering using a zipper or something for these stays, but I didn't have a zipper in stock and I just wanted to get this mock-up done. And so I went ahead and I closed the center front, and I decided to use the crisscross lacing with bunny ears for this, which is what you do in a later corset, like a Victorian corset. Now, traditionally 18th century stays, of course, had the spiral lacing, but I thought it might be easier doing crisscross lacing. So I went ahead and did it this way. I cut off probably 11 yards of my lacing cord, and I laced it this way, leaving a lot of slack, what I thought would be enough to pull them over my head easily. But one of the fit problems with this stays that I would discover soon is that the center back was really much too long, and so because of all that length, my lacing just still wasn't slack enough. So I didn't even put the lacing through every hole, attempting to save on length. And it was still very, very, very hard to pull on over my head, and even harder to get off. I had to do like a weird wiggly dance to get it off of myself. It was truly awful in these days. There was just so many issues. I mean, Again, the first issue is that the center back is way too long, and so it was kind of like pushing into my lower back and not allowing my back to have that natural curve that it does. It was too tight overall. You can see the lacing gap is really way too wide, and the bust to waist ratio was not large enough. I kind of looked like a tree trunk, just very cylindrical, where I should have been more conical shaped. So there's just so many issues, and it was really very discouraging because it's one thing to make many mock-ups of a corset, but it's a completely different thing to make mock-ups of stays because there's just so many boning channels and there's so much more work involved. And it's really very challenging to draft out the tabs of stays properly and, you know, decide how long they should be and how spaced out they should be and what direction they should be facing. There's really a lot of finesse that goes into it, and I really left this experiment with a lot more respect for historical stay makers as well as anyone who can draft their own stays. Another glaring error with these stays is that partly because the waist was too tight and partly because the lower center front is so separate from the sides of the corset, that it kind of like went in at my waist and then whoop, popped out at the bottom and really just gave me this like awkward protruding belly that I don't naturally have, and at least not to that degree anyway. So it was very frustrating, but it is what it is. I did get them on my dress form, you can see that behind me, and if I lace them loosely enough, I think they can still fit her properly so that I'll be able to use it for draping 18th century patterns, which I'm planning on doing very soon. So fingers crossed that will work out okay. Okay, so let's wrap up this little experiment here. I had really planned on this video being a truly fair comparison between the two different eras of corsets and how they treat the body differently and how they reacted in my individual scenario. It was so well-fitting and the 18th century stays were so ill-fitting due to my own errors in drafting. This is really not a fair comparison, and so that comparison is just gonna have to wait for a future video and a future experiment when I've made like an actually good fitting pair of stays and I can accurately compare them and actually wear them for a long period of time. However, I will say that the Victorian corset it's really been quite great. I wanted to see how it works with breastfeeding. It's been great for being able to breastfeed because compared to my Edwardian corset, the top is really much lower, so it's much easier to access things and breastfeed the million times a day that I need to do. And the spoon busk is just so lovely. The spoon busk was really an amazing invention. It's so kind to the postpartum figure and anyone who has a bit of a tummy. I can't help but wonder if maybe it came about during the Victorian era because the fashions were maybe influenced by Queen Victoria, who had like, I don't know, 10 kids or something like that. So yeah, the motto of this video is definitely not Victorian good, 18th century stays bad. And if you've watched my previous video about my maternity stays, you'll know that I absolutely loved my maternity stays, which were actually very well-fitting. And I love stays, and I can't wait to make a pair of very well-fitting stays. So I think I'm planning on actually just buying the Augusta stays pattern that I was originally inspired by and just going ahead and making that and taking a lot of the legwork out of it for me. And I at least plan on having some sort of front lacing, maybe going down halfway, if not an actual like zipper front stays to make them super easy to put on and take off. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like because it helps this content get out to more people like you and like me who want to learn more about this kind of thing. Leave comments and questions below, subscribe to my channel, and hit that notification bell to be notified whenever I post a new video. Check out my blog post, which will be linked below. If you like this kind of content, you'll definitely want to subscribe to my email list. Stay tuned for future videos, and thanks so much for watching, guys. Bye!